for Power Hour with SINE. So Power Hour with SINE is a series of theme-based webinars that SINE, that is Society for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is the technology business incubator at IIT Bombay, have been conducting over the last 1 month. We've had two sessions. We have two sessions. One is on how to prepare for fundraising. And last week we had how to manage your cash flows. So in line with the similar theme, today's session is on the theme of term sheets and due diligence. I'm sure every startup will come across this terms of due diligence and term sheets, especially when they're racing their funds. In fact, at SINE, we have incubated 168 startups, a majority of which have been early stage startups. So stages post a prototype and an MVP is where SINE usually comes in. And of the 168 companies that we have incubated, we have additionally invested in 100 companies, and our investment ranges in the range of 10 lakhs to 1 crore Indian rupees. And for that, we usually have a call for applications, and SINE team curates the startups, and there is an investment committee. And based on the investment committee approval and feedback, we disperse the funding. And most of the funding that SINE receives come from government agencies, and in fact, they will have their own different mandates as well for fund dispersal, etc. So as I said, SINE invests in a seed level, which is in the range of 10 lakhs to 1 crore. And we have kind of a due diligence and term sheets. But from an investor's perspective, we have with us Sushanto, Mitra, and Suman Sengupta from Lead Angels for the session today that we have on demystifying term sheets and due diligence. Just a quick introduction about Lead Angels. Lead Angels is India's first privately owned angel network, which was founded by a team of 3, originally from IIT Bombay in 2014, with the aim of improving early stage investment outcomes. And Sushanto Mitra is the co-founder and CEO of Lead Angels. He, in fact, was a former CEO of SINE, and he's also a Thai chartered member and a member of multiple advisory expert committees such as IIT Gandhinagar, FITT, IIT Delhi, etc. And he has a deep interest in early stage ventures and development of entrepreneurship. And he also mentored various startups at a business idea level, and some of which are doing very well and are global companies in the technology space. He's also visiting faculty for internationally acclaimed conferences and academic institutions, including IITs and IIMs. Welcome, Sushanto. Next, we have with us Suman Sengupta, also from Lead Angels. He is Head Professional Services, Lead Angels, and is also a Senior Chartered Accountant with more than 20 years of experience in finance, strategic planning, and treasury. And he has experience across industrial, telecom, and IT sector in companies such as Siemens, Greaves Cotton, and IDEA. Welcome, Suman. So through this webinar, what we'll do is we have with us 60 minutes, and we will have it in the form of a discussion between Suman and Sushanto. We also have, close to 50 participants now, more than 50 now. We will also take some questions from you, and also as part of the registration form, we have received certain questions. We will try to answer. We have taken that into consideration and have built up into the presentation that we have today, or the information that we have today. We will also try to see if you have other pressing questions that you would like to have covered. We would ask the participants to punch in your questions in the Q&A section you have at the bottom of the panel in front of you. You would not be able to see other participants because of the setting, but we all can see you. And I would request you to put relevant questions pertaining to the topic, that is demystifying term sheets and due diligence, and we would answer them. And now I would hand over to both Sushanto and Suman to take forward. Thank you so much. All the best.
Thanks, Rakesh. Sushanto and I will be this as a back and forth across the PowerPoint. We have quite a number of slides because this is a technical topic. There's a lot of things to talk about, and we will be trying to strive to cover as many as possible. The first thing that we wanted to do is, basically to explain that the partnership between the investor and the investee, the startup, it's in a way like a dance. Sometimes the two work together. Sometimes they draw a little bit apart, but end of the day, they have to go through and complete the circle and get the funding in and the startup running. Sushanto, who would you say that this presentation is specifically for?
First of all, I'd just like to add here that understand that the angel investor or the early stage investor and the entrepreneur are essentially two sides of the same coin. Yep. Just as much as the entrepreneur is taking risk of his or her time, bootstrap money and the hard days that he or she goes through, the angel investor is, or the early stage investor, it could be SINE, it could be any other incubator, or he's also taking a huge risk in terms of the investment opportunity. So they could have invested in fixed deposits, or they could have invested in corporate bonds, could have invested in listed equities, where the risk levels are much lower. So investor is also taking a huge amount of risk. And therefore, that partnership and that dance that Suman spoke about is essentially that if the entrepreneur does well, the investor does well, and if the investor does well, the entrepreneur does well. That's the only way it works. And the term sheet here essentially leads to early who are looking for their first sort of funding, whether it is angel network, and these are very, very relatively simple terms. As you get on to Series A and Series B and Series C, I hope many of you will, these get more and more complex. But this is a fairly simple agreement.
So I think Sushanto has just given you a sort of background about the two parties here. And this slide sort of expands on that. What we've tried to do here is to look at what the founder of the startup and what the investor, what will they be doing in this process, where at the end of the day they will commit funding and on one side and receive funding on the other. The founder is essentially looking to build. He's got the dream. He's looking to build his own startup. While initially he would be struggling to get funding, the last few years we've seen a trend of the rise of the angel network, angel investors who invest at the seed level, and this has become, at least since say about 2015 onwards, there are established players who have come into this space. So it's his job to find these people to convince them of his proposal. And using the monies which they jointly raise, it's create value rapidly. And that is the hallmark of a startup, the use of capital and the scaling up and the push on to the next level, whatever the fate may be. From the investor side, Sushanto, what would be the functions which you typically would look at?
Investor, for us, it is to find promising startups, and that is a very long process. So we receive a lot of startups. They go through a certain level of curation at the executive level. Then they would move to our investment committee. Then they make a pitch. And at the end of it, when we decide, when somebody should interest in the company, we do a business review of the company. And then is a stage where a term sheet is issued to the company. So it's a long process. It could take anywhere between, say, 15 days to 1.5 months from the presentation to the company receiving a term sheet. And for most early stage investors, this is the sort of time frame that is required to issue a term sheet.
So we're looking at screening. We are looking at the red circle here is the term sheet. What are the various things that we have to look at? What the investor is, he or she is asking questions, requesting data. The founder is providing the answers. He's trying to build the business case for investment in his company. Is that you start negotiating terms. In terms of the term sheet, there is an offer, there is a structure which we typically follow, and we'll go into the depths of that. Once this is done, and then we come to the due diligence, the financial and the legal due diligence, and the documentation happens, the legal documentation, the SHA and the SSA. There are conditions, as they're called, and through all the founder
Sushanto, I think the voice is not clear. Maybe we can turn off the video. If you could come slightly closer to the microphone, would be, I think, clearer.
Is okay now?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah. So in the midst of all of this, the company founders have to also run the company, keep on growing, keep on giving answers, and also look for funding. So it is a really complicated task. What we quickly see is that the business due diligence, which is the technical and commercial, is in terms of time span, it takes, as Sushanto said, somewhere between 15 days to 1.5 months. The process from getting through to the final diligence and the documentation up to money in the bank can take up to 3 to 4 months more. So it's not a sprint. It's a little bit of a marathon. Yeah. So what are the learnings, Sushanto, that we can get out of this in terms of the time period and how it reflects on the company in the future?
I think, while the investor is continuously evaluating you, while they are asking for data, while they are negotiating the term sheet, while they are going through the financial due diligence. And one learning is the better prepared you are for all these stages, the smoother the course will be. And a lot of times, early stage companies, including lead angels, we are also a startup of sorts, sort of overlook some very minor things in terms of science. And that later on becomes a sort of huge problem in completing the transaction. That is the learning that prepared for it, and you will be better.
Yeah, because what you will experience in the tough hothouse atmosphere of the fundraise, the first fundraise, it will really help you to define where you reach in the years that follow. Those first 6 or 7 months of during the first fundraise or the second fundraise have a huge impact on which path the company takes after that. Okay, so now we sort of set the stone for the term sheet. One of the things which Rakesh mentioned as one of the feedbacks earlier was that some of the people wanted to actually go through a term sheet, item by item. I think it probably makes sense more to look at it in terms of the structure of a term sheet and what are the elements which are there. And they're basically of two types. One is the economic elements in the term sheet and one are the control elements. Typically, Sushanto, which are the ones that as an early stage investor we focus on more?
So I think, one is the investor, as I said, is also taking a huge risk in terms of the returns from gains. So while the investor is ready to write off the investment that he or she has made, what the investor does not want is that the company does well, but he or she doesn't benefit from it. And these economic losses, as Suman says, are essentially to ensure that as a minority shareholder in a company, the investor is protected, and should there be an opportunity, an exit, the investor is able to participate in that. Or if there is an opportunity to invest again into the company, he or she being one of the shareholders is able to reinvest based on his or her requirements. So, in essence, the minority shareholder is trying to protect their rights vis-a-vis the founders who own majority shares in the company. The term sheet, the subsequent documents essentially provide for that protection.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing here is that we are looking more at economic rights. When you come into a company at an early stage, usually there's not much in there. So you're taking a punt on the promoter. So the questions of control, reserved matters, information matters, I mean, these are, I think, in a way, secondary to the economic considerations. And as Sushanto put it, the ability of the minority shareholder, which all angel investors are, to be able to exit or add to his or her stake at his own, at a time of his own choosing. So he should not be shepherded or guided into a decision which is not optimal for him or her.
I'll just give one example here. There is
Sushanto Ganga here from SINE. I request you to probably wear a headphone and come closer because to your speaker, the microphone, because we're just not able to hear you clearly. While I think Mr. Suman, we are able to hear him clearly. So would you want to maybe...
I'm actually wearing a headphone.
Okay, maybe the video, probably the bandwidth will get better or something.
Is it better now? I'll just increase the volume.
Yeah, much better now.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So the key part here is that the investor wants to protect. The story I was saying is this is about an incubator somewhere in South India, and one of the they did not have a anti-dilution clause. So as soon as the company entered, the startup entered the incubator, the founders issued themselves shares at par. Automatically, the incubator from 2% went down to 1%. So that is what, because they had majority shares, there was no anti-dilution clause, and they were able to reduce the equity of the ownership incubator by half by just doing a rights issue to themselves, which is, if you hold majority shares in a company, you can do. So those are the rights, economic rights, that early stage investor, whether it is an incubator or an angel network or an early stage VC fund, likes to.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do a little dive into these, the economic and the control issues, and we'll sort of spend a couple of minutes on each. So first, why does the valuation, amount of funds required, why do you need it? So first, we have to figure out what is the cash requirement of the business, say over the next 18 months. Please remember that a fundraising process will take somewhere between 4 to 6 months on an average. It can be faster, but usually it's not. And if you and the gap between one and the next is typically about a year and a half. So you should always budget to have the enough money to cover your cash burn for the next 18 months. That should be what is the quantum of funds required. Also, it should be and as a finance guy myself, I always say that it should be the amount of funds which a startup can use most efficiently. Sometimes too much is not a good thing. The other thing which is interesting here is the number of funding rounds which has already happened in the company. Sushanto, does the behavior of the agency, the angel investor change depending on the earlier rounds? If some certain earlier rounds of funding have happened?
So,
complicated cap table?
Yeah. So there are two parts to it. One is that any validation that a startup has, if it has been to an incubator, let us say, worthy as SINE, then obviously the angel feels very comfortable that early investors have put in money. That's a validation of the company and the founder. At the same time, when it comes to financial rights or economic rights, the latter investors want to protect, would like to have relatively stronger economic benefit than the prior investor, because the logic of prior investors have invested at a lower valuation, and the new investor is putting in money at a higher valuation. Therefore, the new investor is taking a larger risk. Hence, they should have more of an upside and protect their downside should an exit option.
So that on one side you have these are the requirements. On the other side, what does the promoter have to balance this with? He has to balance this with the amount of stake dilution. It sort of comes back to the point on the cap table, which Sushanto alluded to a little while. Too much dilution and is a problem. So it's a bit of a how much valuation is possible. These are all things which sort of have feed into each other, and usually the amount of money that you require over the next 18 months or two is a fairly fixed figure. You know how much you need. So it's a question. The variables in this are the stake and the valuation. Okay. So typically, the instruments that a company likes to look at are equity shares, or I've put this as preference shares. This could be compulsorily convertible preference shares, CCPS. It could also be CCDs, which are compulsory convertible debentures, any convertible instrument. Now the point here is that while the entrepreneur usually wants to have a clean equity instrument, the investors would prefer a rigid instrument, an instrument which is convertible at some stage. They're investing in uncertainty, so they want to be able to have a two-step process rather than a one-step process. Sushanto, would that be the correct assumption to make here?
So it's like this. So let's avoiding confusion in terms of jargon. Every trade has its own jargon. The simple understanding is that if a company and there's an exit opportunity, then and the company receives less than 100 rupees, let us say, then, or let's say the company receives only 100 rupees when then I, as an investor, would like to get that 100 rupees back. And then whatever is left goes to the rest of the shareholders. The mechanism of doing this is through preference shares.
Yeah.
Cumulative convertible debentures, preference shares. But in essence, what the investor is, I put in X, I would like to withdraw that X first, and then whatever is left, participate in that or get a return on that. So that is what that preference means, that when there is a liquidity event, when the company is being closed down, or when there is an exit option, the investor should get at least his money back, or as much of the money that he or she has invested back. Then the rest of the people can participate. So that they are protecting the downside of the investment. Of course, having said that, if the company is worth zero, he's also going to get zero, because 100% of zero is also
exactly. Yeah. And one of the instruments which have come into sort of prominence in the recent past, which is the the SAFE. These in India are actually structured as CPS as preference shares. Okay, so moving along. The thing is that when we talk to our investors, when we talk to the people who come to us for investment, the startups, one thing that we always ask them to fill in the form is what happens in terms of an exit. So it's a question that an exit will happen or how it will happen. It's something that you prepare for. This has to be addressed in the term sheet. And you have to give a time frame. Usually, months is considered a good time frame, and a mechanism for the value discovery. The fair value at that point in time, how it's to be arrived at. This, the very, the ways in which this can happen is the promoters buying back the shares, if there's a strategic sale to another company, or if everybody is really lucky and the company does well, there's an IPO. The point that we're trying to make here is this is something which is mentioned upfront and center in the term sheet at the beginning of the life cycle of the company as well. Now coming to one of the, and these are the economic clauses, the ones which Sushanto was talking about, which put the investor at the front of the line. These are, and it's very hard to avoid using a lot of jargon when you're talking about finance, and ROFOs and ROFers have been around for quite a long time. So we'll use them, but by and large, it's we should try to not use jargon to confuse people, but to explain exactly what they mean. So these protect the existing shareholders. In this case, the investors, the minority shareholders, from dilution of their holdings. This is the point earlier. This is a positive reinforcement to their rights. They get to jump the gun. They get to the head of the front of the queue. They have control over their future. So the first piece, Sushanto, would you want to pick up on this?
Yeah. So I'm just giving an example. Let us say the promoter holds 90% of the company and the investor holds 10%. Now, there is a for the 90% of the promoter shares. Now, the promoter sells all his shares to that new investor. And the investor who's existing remains holding those shares. Right? Now, he has no control who's buying the shares. Could be, not reputable. It could be a competitor. Ibrahim, for example. Yeah, it could be a competitor. It could be anything. Yeah. The key part is that the investor is not able to sell his shares. And that is the primary reason why the investor invested in the first place, is to exit from the investment so that they can invest in some other company. If SINE has to invest in new companies, it also needs an exit from the existing investments that it has made. Likewise for individual investors. So that talk about here, but that is called a tag along right. That if the promoter is selling his shares, the founder is selling his shares, then I can also tag along with him and sell my shares. Therefore, be able to get an exit. Similarly, this is a protective clause that if there is somebody buying the shares of the company as an outsider, then the existing shareholder get the first right. Your when you bring your new car in, the family members get the first right in that car. Right? You can't let somebody else, some other strange person, take that right. So the same way, if you are making a fresh issue of shares in your company, your existing shareholders, including the investors, get a first right of refusal, saying we would like to invest in the company rather than an outsider.
Sushanto, I'm Poini here. Hi, Suman. Sorry,
Hi, Poini.
Sorry to intervene here. Sushanto, I think your audio clarity is not really, helping, because we are also getting feedback here on this chat that you are not properly, audible. So one way is that you could adjust, either you can switch off your video and see whether, your bandwidth is basically consumed more efficiently. Another way is that Suman's audio is very, very clear. So in that case, Suman can pick up the question, and if he can answer also, that could work. So we can have one experiment without you having on video. Let's see whether audio quality is coming up properly. Otherwise, we request Suman to, continue, because Suman's questions are very, very clearly audible. Your answers are not really audible. So I thought I'll just intervene.
Sure. Makes sense. So let's give this a try.
Yeah, let's give this a try. In the meantime, while you're adjusting it, I'll just talk a little further. So, okay, so here I'm just, in this slide, I'm just trying to compare and contrast what an ROFO and ROFR is. A ROFO allows an existing who wants to stay in to purchase, so that he gets a first right in case the company wants to sell more shares. He gets the first right to be able to buy them. Similarly, a ROFR is the, it's the mirror image of that. It's that, if a non-selling share, it gives them the right to purchase the shares of a selling shareholder. In both cases, I want to stay invested in the company. But if another shareholder wants to sell, in order to make sure that an undesirable element, a competitor, somebody who you don't feel is good for the future of the company, comes to get those shares first. We have the right to refuse first. Only after we have refused can they go back to them. This is, of course, it depends on the financial ability of those shareholders to purchase the sale shares, and there are lots of other things involved here. But in a sense, these are the two things which are the preemptive rights that we were talking about. Sushanto briefly talked about the anti-dilution clause. Basically, this protects you in the case if you have made, the amount that you've invested in a company gets crystallized into a certain number of shares at a certain value. If there is a round which is at a lower value, then then your investment goes down. The anti-dilution clause, and I think Sushanto talked about an incubator down south. I think another important case in this was of course the old Facebook and Savarin case, where the anti-dilution was not used and the full ratchet dilution was there, and it became a real problem for the minority shareholder in that case. So there are two methods. In India, we don't actually use the full ratchet method. We use what's known as the weighted average anti-dilution. This becomes a little more complicated, but it's basically a formula where we take the number of shares which are now being offered, the number of shares which you already have, and we come to a sort of a figure which sort of gives the weighted average of the two for the new shares which be given to the old shareholders. This, of course, can be done in two ways. If in the case of and benefit, when we talk about having a convertible instrument like a CCD or a CCPS, in this you can insulate yourself against anti-dilution by tweaking the conversion ratio. So that's a much more painless method of going about things. This is the tag along clause essentially allows minority shareholders to sell their share. So basically, in case a large shareholder wants, for whatever reason, and we're comfortable staying in the company, tag along with that. As you can see in the picture, the guy at the front peddling is very much the majority shareholder, and you know the shareholders should have the ability to. So we're not forced to work with somebody against our will. Now, there are a couple of tricky issues here. Thinking is that, do you take a 51%? If 51% is sold, is that when the tag along clause is triggered? Who gets to pull the trigger in case there are 2 or 3 different investors? These things need to be discussed and negotiated. Sometimes there is a change of happens without actually selling of the 51% share. So we have to look at the circumstances behind the transaction. The ability to go and examine each case and have the safeguards to look at each case and determine whether we're going to do a tag along or not is important. Sushanto, are you back?
Yeah. You can hear me?
Yeah. So this LP is your area.
Right. So again, as I said, simply, as I explained earlier, that if the company is being liquidated, then the investors would like to recover their investment as much as possible. They get a 15% return on their capital, or get 1.5 times the capital, and then the rest of the shareholders can get their shares. This is essentially to make the investor's business viable, right? But you must understand the investor has taken capital from other people and then deployed it to invest in your company and many other companies. If he is not able to return the capital to his investors with a certain amount of profit, then his or her business will go down. Right? So this is basically to make sure that they can minimize their losses in the company is going down. And of course, if the company does well and you're getting a 10x return, then everybody shares equally. Then there is not a problem. It is only in the limiting case that the company is almost selling at, invested at 100 rupees, is selling at 100 rupees, or selling at less than 100 rupees. That is the time that the investor wants to have a downside protection.
Yeah. But liquidation preference is usually one of the most critical parts of the LP clause. It's usually one of the most critical parts of the entire term sheet. It's one where people actually spend a lot of time and effort in determining what is the liquidation preference amount, whether it's 1x, whether it gives a return in terms of an IRR rate, and how it's worked out over what period of time. So this is something that, honestly speaking, I would say probably disproportionately important. We will briefly skate over, and this is in terms of the cap table, is the pool. Now, the most important thing here is that usually investors insist that they don't get diluted by the ESOP pool. That means that, if they're investing in a stake, you would want the ESOP pool to be already considered. And by and large, one thing we have seen is that investors do say that, activate the ESOP before we come in. In smaller companies, in startups, sometimes that is a problem. So then you do all the calculations, assuming that the 10% or whatever figure is created, ESOP pool is already in place in order to arrive at the shareholding, the effective shareholding that the investor will get. Yeah. So now we come to the drag along rights, which allows the investor to drag the other shareholder in, if there is a given event. That means that, these are exceptional situations, and this is an unusual situation. So we have the right for that the promoters or the larger, investors, the other investors, they should be able to sell to our buyer on exactly the same terms and conditions that we have already agreed. So we can pull them along. And this is, we had also mentioned in the exit strategy, this is one of the things which sort of buttresses or protects that particular, right that we have. And the drag along right, for good governance, it ensures that some of the smaller, minority shareholders do not act as a barrier, and also the promoter, in case we come to that exceptional situation where we want to sell and get out, and the buyers insist that everybody else should also come in.
Just to say this, one point, that this is usually the biggest contentious point as far as the entrepreneur is concerned. Yeah. Because physically nobody likes to be dragged along, and financially also nobody likes to be dragged.
Yeah, it's a question of the control. Who has control?
But having said that, let us understand that I don't know, and I can say with all my gray hair that I've been in this industry for more than 20 years. I have not seen a drag along clause being enforced. It is more of a sort of
deterrent,
board hanging.
Yeah.
It's just a deterrent. It is never possible to sell a company without the founders being in sync and in agreement with an exit situation. So it is there, the lawyers are paid to write it, and so on. But effectively, it is never enforced.
And I think we'll same comment about another one which the lawyers love, which is vesting. But we'll come to that. Now we come to some of the matters which are not economic in nature, but which are control matters, which are the reserved matters. This talks about exceptional events, non-routine, and the investor shareholders say, guys, before you go ahead and do any of these things, you need to talk to us. You need to take our permission. So these are things typically like, a new fundraise, changing the capital structure, changing the board, the governance, getting into borrowings. Red flags are always things like changing the accounting year, or suddenly hiring people who are at a certain level.
Again, to make in the interest of time, since time is running very short.
Yeah.
All I will say is that that you don't go for a holiday with your wife with the money that the investor has invested and when it was not part of the business plan. So anything which as a minority shareholder, you don't want money to go into your fund the founders holidays in Switzerland, and reserve matters make sure that those are not possible.
Okay. Some of the other concern areas we've seen, two I'd like to just dwell on very quickly. One of them is vesting, and one of them is information rights, and we see and employment contracts. Vesting, Sushanto, is have you actually seen? What is your view on vesting? Does it actually work?
So vesting typically comes into play when a company has not in the early stages of a company. So it's not really relevant for angel investing and even early stage VC investing, which is only in subsequent rounds where the company no longer is totally dependent on the founder.
Yeah.
And if there is a vesting, then and the founder, for example, uh, has some additional shares vested in him, and he or she is not performing or has some legal cases against him or her, or has done something which is morally wrong, then the people may want to remove. This is rarely used, not in early stage. I think there have been only one or two cases, as I know, in the Indian startup community, where the CEO has been removed and therefore lost his or her shares which were yet to vest.
Yet to vest, or the other alternative is what's known as a clawback, which is another thing which is extremely rare. But we do spend a lot of time when doing the term sheet on the. Yeah.
I think, Suman, given the time that we are at,
Yeah.
audio and then we can perhaps take questions on this.
So what I'll try to do is to just quickly go through some of the points on due diligence. What are the questions that the due diligence looks at? Financial or legal? And I have a slightly different perspective on this because I've been a user of due diligence reports for most of my life. So I like to think of, what do I get out of these? I would typically want my due diligence reports, anything to sort of validate or not validate my investment hypothesis. If I'm looking at to invest in a company and they say, okay, this company's gross margin is say 50%, like the financial due diligence, which is data which the company itself provides, to sort of back me up on this, or at least tell me where it actually stands. Similarly, the legal due diligence is something, I'm going on an average that the companies that we invest in are say 1.5 to 2.5 years old. They would have a certain number of filings with the MCA, maybe 60, 100 filings at best. So they may have had done an earlier round. In that case, the legal due diligence should not be very complicated. In terms of what we're looking at, it's actually more the secretarial audit than legal. But what would they be looking at? They'd be looking at the contracts which have been done with with different parties, with related parties. What are the arrangements with the promoters in terms of the loans, in terms of other things? Where are they in terms of IP protection? Those are the things that typically, the legal due diligence would look at. Financial diligence would be looking at the same commercial contracts, but from the point of view of the financial implications. It would be looking at cash management. Usually is an item which is not very well understood. Now, the third party information that you get when you look at a bank statement of of a startup and you know from month to month how much is coming in and how much is going out, will tell you what the burn is. Similarly, GST records, TDS records will tell you about 90% of of the turnover and the purchases of the companies, and these are externally verified records. So you should be able to get a very good idea of the cash management and how much runway the company currently has. The amount that he is asking for, is it appropriate if he's looking at, say, 18 months or 12 months of runway? So these are the things that we would look at. A certain way of dealing with these. We try to ensure that it either goes back to the investment hypothesis that we have built and tests the various assumptions which are made. What can a startup do to help us in terms of the due diligence? ID, keep their shareholding as simple as possible. They should try and no contracts are all contracts are properly made with all third parties. How is the loans being taken? You will have to micromanage cash, record all agreements, and maintain good records. The first stage. Once you have that, then it's easy to build on that. It gives a vote of confidence in the company, because if a due diligence can be completed easily without too many problems, it means that at least we know that the quality of record keeping and information going forward should also be good. Now, we've had to sort of go back, but I think
I'll just say one thing here, that I have not seen, again, in due diligence, when does a due diligence fail? So most of the time, investors go ahead, even if the due diligence report is not. It says company does not have a proper cash management system. Company's contracts are all vague. Company doesn't have employee contracts. There's nothing. It only gets delayed when, one, the company has given away its IP to somebody else through a contract. B, it has not paid attention to RBI guidelines in terms of foreign investments.
Yep.
Or it has not submitted the reports to the Ministry for Company Affairs. Here, it does not mean that the due diligence fails. It takes much longer. So when we say that it takes 3 to 6 months, those additional 3 months is usually meant for the companies to rectify the mistakes that they may have made in oversight. And this happens at different stages, especially in early stages. These little things, I can give a simple example of a company. They've taken a 5 lakh rupee investment from their uncle in their company, who happened to be an NRI. And the fine for that was 4x, almost equal to the investment we were making in that company. So we had no other option but to wait till that RBI permission. And so those are the sort of things that you need to make sure. Some basic things have to be in place. And don't talk about sales which you don't have, clients which are not on board, because if that comes out very clearly in the due diligence, then that might go up.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one more point here. Everybody understands that there will be issues. It's how we deal with them, in terms of either conditions precedent or conditions subsequent, in terms of rectification. We can only identify the risks and mitigate against those. However, it's to the benefit of the startup to ensure that the due diligence process is done smoothly. We have seen examples where due diligence have been delayed, and it's caused the startup company to miss opportunities which would have been value accretive for that company. and and because the issues that were raised were very much solvable, very much within their control. Should you do a pre-audit before you go for funding? Maybe not. So, the typical good housekeeping in terms of your accounts and compliance is something that you should try to maintain. Although, given the amount of compliance that there is nowadays, it can be an uphill task. Yeah. So now, Rakesh, I think it's probably best we go to questions. We still have 4 or 5 minutes left, so we can attempt some.
Yeah. So participants, can I request you to type in your questions in the Q&A box there? Please make it relevant to the topic and what you've listened to. If you have any further questions, you could ask. One of the questions which came up, Suman and Sushanto, is with regards to safe notes, which is something a simple agreement for future equity, making the term sheet much simpler. What is your take on it? Is it better to have a simple term sheet, or because after this we'll be having a detailed shareholders agreement? But what is your take on safe notes?
Suman is the expert. I will let Suman know.
Yeah, so okay, so I think safe or the iSafe, these are basically end of the day CCPS, convertible preference shares. The way that it's structured is that they are templatable formats. They work at a certain stage of the business, at a very early stage, and in the last 6 months or about a year, we have seen them come into vogue. Typically, the investors that we look at are looking at slightly, a little further down the line. They do look at due diligence. They do look at ensuring bank standard contracts. For them, perhaps the safe is not the right thing, but I do agree that for small amounts of money and for very early stage, companies, safe is definitely a quicker option, one which I see that, for quantums of say 10 lakhs or 15, 20 lakhs, I have seen companies take that up.
Thanks, Suman. So for early stage startup, lesser funding, safe note is a better option. Thanks for that.
It's a quick option. It's a quick option.
Quick option.
Absolutely.
Right. We have another question. The question is whether information memorandum is prerequisite before a term sheet.
No, absolutely, it's not. I think we empathize and we understand the pressures that the founders are under, and if we ask them to make an info memo, then and also run the business and also run after financiers, then it's going to be really tough. We most early stage investors do help the founders prepare at least what's known as the business due diligence, in which if you give us a certain set of records, we sort of work together with them to develop an investment pitch. An info memo is slightly more detailed than that. I think it's a bit further along the line when you're maybe Series A level. At the angel or seed level, an investment pitch with good granularity of information is enough.
Right. Thanks, Suman. The question is towards valuation. Is a valuation certificate mandatory for startups to get funding?
Okay. If you want to get funding, you will require a valuation certificate. Now, there's been a lot of confusion about where do you get the valuation certificate from, and for a DPIIT, all I can say right now, and very simple, this is a cost which you have to add to the cost of raising funds if you want to raise it, if you want to raise a premium, because you have to be able to justify that premium, and you will require a valuation certificate. Whether along with that you will require, if you're raising funds from people who are not in India, then you may require further valuation certificates specific for that, like the chartered accountant, which is an additional cost. But yes, To answer your question very briefly, you will reply.
It's 17 hours. You'll reply. It's 5 o'clock now. Probably we'll take another 5 questions. 5 minutes for question and answer, because we're getting some interesting Q&A. I hope it is fine.
One question which I've actually gone through here, which came to me a little in advance, which is how detailed should the term sheet be? And that's a sort of follow-on from the safe question. Typically, I've been in lots of situations where people are making documentation and they're sort of sitting around the table and shouting at each other and saying, this wasn't decided or agreed in the term sheet. So if you have a really, really brief term sheet, which doesn't take care of details, then you will have a lot more discussions again at the documentation stage. Try to make it detailed and as comprehensive as possible early in the stage. Then when you do the documentation, and the more number of people, you'll have lawyers coming in at that point in time, and they have their own interesting ways of looking at documentation. It just prolongs the process. So have it detailed if you can early on, so that then you don't get into a conflict in the. Yeah, please go ahead.
Right. So another question is in terms of the timeline which is involved for the whole due diligence process. I know it really depends, but on an average, how much does it take?
There's one cunning and very interesting caveat that we always put in terms of when we look at due diligence proposals, and that is to say that typically, and for us, I'm talking about, which is say 1.5 or 2 years old, which has gone through one audit cycle, we'd say that it should, legal and financial due diligence should not take more than 10 working days. And the caveat is, provided all details are provided, upfront. It never happens like that. So let's be practical and say it's going to take about a month, because details are ongoing. People have other jobs to do. There's another interesting thing. The due diligence timelines will change depending on when you get the due diligence done. If due diligence in say April or May, then you can actually access the audited accounts and you don't have to do much more. If you're doing the due diligence say in December, then you'll be looking at unaudited statements for a long period before. So that will take time to construct or in some cases reconstruct. So there are lots of factors there, but I would say that 10 to 15 working days is all that it should take, for a small company which is seeking funds for the first.
Got it. Thanks, Suman. So we have an interesting entrepreneur here. So he or she is saying that how to deal with investors who say that term sheets are non-negotiable. This is a fixed rate that we have, a fixed percentage. How do you go ahead in negotiating with the investor?
Of course, it depends on the cycle of investment. So, depending on the time, who has a stronger negotiating power. Having said that,
it's a dance. Who's leading the dance?
But usually, investors, especially early stage investors, whether it is an incubator or in the angel network, will have a standard format of, and there is limited scope for the investor himself or herself to negotiate, to really, there are certain minimum things which must be there in the spreadsheet. And that those are non-negotiable. So, for example, we talked about tag along, drag along, loafer, LP clauses. These are non-negotiable, really, because they protect the minority shareholder rights. They are not there, we don't have them. What is, however, negotiable are things like saying whether the LP clause will be really tight or will be a little loose, whether whether the investor will agree on a third party doing a valuation in case of a tag along clause, or the anti-dilution will not be, narrow casted or broadcasted. There are there are there are nuances which are negotiable, or the vesting period can be extended. Those are the things which investors are willing to negotiate and do negotiate, but these basic sort of terms are non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
Got it. Thanks. We have a question from Manveen Chadha. Can you have a look at it, Suman? He asked.
You'll have to read it out to me.
Sure. So he's asking, what is stockholder voting power through super voting stock? Can we achieve this model in which the person will have less shares but control over the decisions? I can repeat it. What is stockholder voting power through the super voting stock?
I don't think it is applicable in India. We have non-voting shares.
And differential voting rights is still something which is coming in. As a concept, this is something which you have more in outside of India, where you have Series A and Series B stock. However, the concept behind what you're looking at, Manveen, is that does a person who has relatively small voting rights, has he got the ability to control larger decisions? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Through the reserved matters, even if a person has preference shares, the agreement, the term sheet, the documentation can say that yes, you will vote as diluted, as converted into equity stock. And if your rights and your duties are all taken from the documentation and put in the articles of association, then it's there. I mean, if you have a right to vote, who becomes the, whether they can borrow 1 crore and above, or whether they can, sell a stake to X or Y or Z, that will be in articles, and that's very possible. So it's not the how it's done; it's the underlying principle which can be followed.
Right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we'll have to stop now, unfortunately. But there are more questions which has come through. In case if any of the participants wants to get in touch with Lead Angels, is there an email address they can reach out to you on that you could share?
Yeah, you can contact us at
info@leadangels.com.
Yeah.
info@leadangels.com.
Right.
In.
info@leadangels.in, and also at SINE, if you're interested in pitching to us for incubation, you could also do that by sending an email to bd@sineIITB.org. It's BD is short for business development. I can just type it down. Can someone help me in typing it down in the chat? Swati or Dashrat or somebody, if you could type it down in the chat for me. It's bd@sineIITB.org. It's been an insightful session. I think there's been a lot of comments which has come in and the question and answers. The good part is that the webinar is recorded and will be made available on the SINE YouTube link, and will be shared across to all of you who have registered. So if you haven't registered, do send out an email to bd@sineIITB.org or info@leadangels.in, and we will be getting back to you with our answers. Thank you so much, Suman and Sushanto, for this very insightful session. And we obviously we work very closely with each other, and we look forward to more interactions.
Yeah, and we'd like to, from Lead Angels, take the thank you, Rakesh, and thank the team at SINE. It's always a pleasure to interact with me and Ganga and the rest of the team. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ram.
Yeah, bye then.